Today, we'll be talking about the war in Ukraine. We're speaking with Vijay Prashad. He is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, chief editor of Leftward books. He is a prolific author and the author of Red Star Over the Third World. Vijay Prashad, welcome back to the Socialist Program.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
Vijay, there's new news about the Ukraine war. Of course, we've been following it carefully since before the Russian military operation or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Going back a couple months now, and it's very important for our audience, and especially for people on the left. This is the Socialist Program, to keep in clear focus what caused the crisis. The war had a certain beginning, but it had a prelude, and the prelude is critically important for us to understand why the war started, why Russia did what it did, and also what the path towards peace would be. It's one thing to go out and say Russia should immediately stop the war, and of course we don't support the Russian military operation in Ukraine. We think it's a terrible tragedy. The Ukrainian and Russian people were one people, the Soviet people, living together, sharing the benefits of socialism, at one time fighting together to defeat fascism during World War II. So it's a great tragedy. But simply protesting against Russia doesn't get to the root of the problem, nor does it lead us to a path towards peace, because Russia obviously took this action knowing that it would be evicted from the world economy, knowing it would suffer huge economic losses, because it felt compelled to do so. And now we have people all over the world waving Ukrainian flags and caring about Ukrainian lives. But if you actually care about the lives of Ukrainians, if you think of Ukrainians not as a pawn in somebody else's geostrategic chessboard, you have to think, well, how could the war end? And actually, we believe the war could end the same way the war could have been avoided, which is for the United States and NATO to sit down and negotiate with the Russians and meet their legitimate national security concerns, which were mainly not to have Ukraine and other Soviet or Russian allies, previous Soviet republics, be incorporated into NATO and thus used as a staging ground for advanced nuclear and conventional missiles that would target Russia. That's the path to peace. I want to talk to you specifically about why NATO took this aggressive position. Why the confrontation with Russia? It didn't just start even in the last few months. And to do it, I think it's helpful to go back to the origin of NATO itself and the post-World War II sort of framework, the U.S. framework, where the U.S. becomes the dominant superpower in the world. And I know you have talked about this a lot. You have a lot to say, extremely interesting presentations. I want to start, though, with an audio clip. It's quite famous now. We've used it before on our show. It's Victoria Nuland, who was at that time Assistant Secretary of State, talking to the U.S. ambassador in Kiev about the coup that was taking place, or this was before the coup, the Maidan protests, the days before the coup in February 2014. Let's listen to this clip because it speaks, in fact, directly to the points that you've been making. Let's listen.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work. So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it and, the EU.
Vijay, those are very choice words to describe such an important ally as the EU, but it says so much about how the U.S. is actually the puppet master here.
Well, Brian, let's understand what the EU is and what NATO is, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO isn't sui generis. It wasn't created out of nothing by itself. In the immediate period after World War II, the United States developed a series of treaty organizations, whether it was the treaty with the Inter-Regional Treaty in the Americas, the so-called Rio Pact of 1947, then the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 1949. Subsequent to that, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, 1954, the Manila Pact, and then the Baghdad Pact of 1955, the Central Treaty Organization. What each of these were attempts by the United States to cement its allies in different parts of the world and extend the force of US power. I mean, it's because of these treaty organizations that the US was able to create bases all over the world. Now, 800 bases in some 80 countries. I mean, the Manila Pact is what allowed the United States to establish and extend the Subic Bay base, which sat there, for decades. The NATO pact with the North Atlantic countries allowed the United States to produce bases all across Western Europe, including the famous base in Mannheim in Germany and so on. So, NATO was essentially not a treaty with Europeans as equal partners and the Canadians and so on. It's not an equal table. This is an instrument for US power projection in different parts of the world. Now, most of these treaty organizations, Brian, just disappeared in time. Some disappeared because, well, the relations of forces changed in these parts of the world. United States wasn't able to maintain its power effectively enough. But NATO outlived all of them. And in fact, in 1990-91, there was a suggestion that perhaps NATO should be disbanded. After all, Soviet Union is gone, the Warsaw Pact is gone, the communist state system is no longer around. What does Europe or the North Atlantic need defending from? At that time in 1991, Boris Yeltsin was in power in Russia. He was totally open to the West. In fact, NATO and Russia opened negotiations after 1991, and Russia becomes a partner of NATO in that immediate period. So, why was NATO to remain in existence? A serious question was raised. So, what I want to first indicate is when Victoria Nuland, who, by the way, was recently in Colombia and in New Delhi, and you got to be afraid when Victoria Nuland goes anywhere because you never know what's coming next after experience in Ukraine. When Victoria Nuland says, F the EU, what she's saying essentially is, look, the Europeans are an instrument of our power. In that same clip, she talks about the United Nations, instrumentalize the United Nations. If the EU doesn't, get in line with us, push them aside. We don't need them. We'll directly put our own people in charge in Kiev. So, look, if you're a European, you got to listen to that clip and understand your situation. Firstly, the European Union is treated as essentially a instrument of US power, and NATO is the United States Trojan horse in Europe. That's effectively what it is. The United States began to put pressure on the whole of Europe and parts of Asia to basically capitulate to its understanding of the world. This was fine, Brian, up to around 2007. In fact, Vladimir Putin, who was Boris Yeltsin's prime minister and then the president who took over after Boris Yeltsin, Mr. Putin was also eager for integration with Europe and the West in the first several years of his presidency. 2007, after the world financial crisis, I think a really different orientation came there in Moscow. They began to understand that the United States was not that keen on integrating Russia on an equal footing. And I must say, the spur for the Ukraine war now was not just in 2014. It's when Trump unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Missile Treaty, the INF, in 2018, and then the Russians followed immediately after. That was the spur because it suggested to the government in Russia that the United States was interested in placing intermediate nuclear missiles very close to the border of Russia, and those missiles would be able to strike important cities in Russia without Russia being able to defend against their arrival. And I think that was a game changer for Moscow, and it accelerated this conflict.
Indeed. We had the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was a primary piece of the Cold War arms control uh, architecture that created some degree of equilibrium, meaning neither side could develop missile defense shields such that it would give the other side a first strike capability, meaning you could launch your nuclear weapons first, you take out 95 or 97 or 98% of the enemy's nuclear weapons, and then you have missile defense shields to pick up the remnants, the 2 or 3%. So yeah, a few nuclear weapons come through, you lose 20 million people or 100 million people, but you win the war. And so the calculus of Cold War thinking, where one side thought maybe we can win a nuclear war, that was basically eviscerated with the those kind of arms agreements, the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Putin said a few years ago the cancellation of the ABM treaty was critical in terms of the relations going south between the U.S. and Russia. But then to cancel the INF treaty in 2019, at the very same time, the U.S. changes its military doctrine and says, look, the war on terror is no longer the priority. It's now major power conflict, meaning war with Russia and China will be the priorities for budgeting, contingency planning, war gaming, et cetera, et cetera. This sends a message to Russia and to China. Look, the U.S. is actually getting ready for war with you, and it's canceled these two important treaties. Now, again, for the audience, Vijay, you know it well, but the INF treaty was the byproduct of Europe standing up in 1982 and 83. That's when the anti-nuclear movement, the freeze movement, took off. In the United States on June 12th, 1982, 1 million people marched in Central Park demanding a treaty like this and a freeze on nuclear weapons. So Reagan and Gorbachev signed that treaty in 1986. It means the missiles that were placed in Europe by Reagan in 81, 82, that had a flight time of 6 minutes to their targets, and all of their targets in the Soviet Union were at the political offices of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, mayor's offices, political offices everywhere. The Soviets were alarmed and thought war was coming because they couldn't defend against those kind of missiles. So that treaty was an essential feature for Russia's national security. I couldn't agree with you more that the cancellation of that treaty by Trump, and without any debate, I mean, all this anti-Trump sentiment in America, where was the sentiment against the cancellation of the INF treaty? Go ahead.
In fact, it's very interesting, Brian, because it comes at the time when the world community, the term international community is used extremely precisely. It basically means the North Atlantic countries, with the United States dictating the terms. But in that same period, the world community rallied around a new treaty which called for the abolition of nuclear weapons. In fact, the group that pushed that treaty won the Nobel Prize for Peace. It was a very important period. And yet, in the middle of all that, as you say, two important things happen. The United States changes its basic doctrine, puts pressure now on Russia and China, and on the other side says, look, we don't care about nuclear, the nuclear control mechanisms that we had, ABM, INF, and so on. But what was underneath that? What was underneath that, I feel, was that there was a sneaking suspicion in Washington, D.C., that the Russian and Chinese project that had emerged after the world financial crisis, the first attempt to create a different project was called the BRICS in 2009, 2 years after the world financial crisis, when Brazil, India, South Africa joined with Russia and China to try to create an alternative set of institutions, including financial transfer mechanisms, perhaps to de-dollarize and so on. All of that was on the table, a new intellectual property regime and so on. All of that had been discussed in BRICS. Of course, BRICS fell apart because in India and in Brazil, right-wing governments were elected in, and these right-wing governments subordinated themselves to US foreign policy. So that was the end of BRICS. There was relative incoherence politically in South Africa, and so it began to play less of a role. But the BRICS continues. They still meet, they still have discussions about some of these issues, but it was not a serious body of for an alternative. The Russians and Chinese, meanwhile, started to integrate more. Let's face facts, Brian. Russia is essentially an exporter of primary commodities, especially energy. I mean, that's what it is. The United States and its NATO partners actually scuttled Europe's ability to import energy. The Iranians no longer were able to export energy to Europe. The Libyans couldn't get the energy to Europe because of that NATO war in 2011. And so the Europeans increasingly became reliant on Russian energy exports. At the same time, the United States just can't seem to get together its political, problems inside, and US driven capitalism is in some serious disarray. At this time, China appears in 2013 with the Belt and Road Project. 17 European countries sign up for it, including Italy, which is a serious member of the G7 and so on. This posed a real challenge to the United States. I remember this clip when Trump is sitting across the table from Jens Stoltenberg, who is the head of NATO, and Trump is scolding NATO and Europe, in the same kind of way that Victoria Nuland said, F NATO, well, F the EU. He's telling NATO, look, you want us, the United States, to provide a security umbrella for you against the Russians. Trump says it directly, against the Russians. Meanwhile, you're paying the Russians billions of euros every year for energy. So why should we defend you against people that you're enriching? Trump says this directly. That means that the United States was beginning to sense that Europe was moving from a North Atlantic orientation to a Eurasian orientation. And much of the conflict around Ukraine is around trying to pivot this away, to trying to pivot Europe back to a North Atlantic orientation and not integrate deeper with China, particularly, but to some extent with Russia. So certainly the kind of adventurism, nuclear adventurism that was on the table from the Trump administration and not revoked by Biden at all. There was no complaint when Trump went into this nuclear adventurist mode. This is really what accelerates the crisis. Of course, we do not, want to say that, the Russian government should have advanced into Ukraine. Of course not. But the crisis was accelerated by the United States using NATO and using not just a military threat, but a nuclear threat. That's a very significant thing, Brian, which I don't think has been enough part of our conversations.
No, I couldn't agree more. And when you look back at the last couple months, and especially the last 4 weeks, if the United States had this sense that Europe, and especially Germany as the leader of Europe, was gravitating towards the east, dependent on Russia for its natural gas, that 17 countries in Europe integrating into the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, how do you get those countries back into the bloc? How do you reinforce bloc discipline? Of course, a confrontation, a military confrontation, is the answer. We played on this show over the last 2 weeks audio clips from Antony Blinken's comments in the run-up to the February 24th invasion, and Blinken is very sanguine about what's coming. He's like, look, we have credible evidence, and we are convinced the Russians are going to invade. And there's no sense of alarm in his voice. There's no sense like we have to do something urgently to stop this terrible catastrophe from happening. Like, for instance, go back to the negotiating table or negotiate in earnest. They're very sanguine. And then on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, he says, well, look, if they invade, if they don't invade, fine. If they do invade, we're ready. Kind of like, it's kind of a ho-hum attitude. And they were very predictive that the Russians were indeed going to invade. So they either knew they were going to invade. Maybe Russia was signaling enough, if you don't negotiate with us seriously, we have plan B, the military option. But it feels like they weren't unhappy about the Russian invasion. And when you look at what's happened in the aftermath of the invasion, I think the U.S. is quite happy. Wall Street Journal is not alarmed. They're happy. There's proposals to double the U.S. military budget. And by the way, Vijay, you said that NATO is really just an extension or a fig leaf for American power. The U.S. military budget is about $780 billion. The next 29 countries in NATO, their combined military budget is $360 billion. So only half. Those 29 countries have half of what the U.S. spends. And it leads me to the conclusion that the U.S. wanted this outcome because they could feel the drift, the disintegration of their control over Europe. And you mentioned about how the Russians weren't alarmed about NATO before. They were actually a partner with NATO after Yeltsin came in. In 1954, after Stalin died, in that interim period right before Khrushchev consolidates power, the Soviets actually offered to join NATO then. That was in the middle of the Cold War. They said their only condition was don't integrate West Germany into NATO. And we, the Soviets, support the reunification of Germany. They weren't hooked on a socialist East Germany. They said, let's reunify Germany, but have it be non-military, to which the United States says, absolutely not. Now, that would make no sense from a security point of view, but if the United States was worried that a reunified Germany and a Europe that was back on its feet didn't have an existential enemy or was locked into confrontation, it would indeed, as it had in the past, gravitate towards Russia.